You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at this week's NATO summit. Afghanistan topped the agenda for the two-day meeting of Western allies on Sunday and Monday in the United States. There are cracks in Washington's plans for an orderly drawdown and transfer to Afghan-led security by the end of 2014. France insists its troops will leave 2 years earlier than then. Pakistan and the US are arguing over reopening military supply routes into the country. Meanwhile, NATO leaders launched the first phase of a missile shield designed to knock out attacks on Europe by enemies such as Iran. The system has soured relations with Moscow, which fears it will undermine its own nuclear deterrent. Russia's newly inaugurated President Vladimir Putin avoided the Chicago summit in what is seen as growing hostility to the West. So, can the US and NATO orchestrate an orderly handover in Afghanistan? Will missile defense continue to strain relations between Washington and Moscow? And what can we expect from the newly inaugurated Putin's foreign policy? To answer these questions, we're hosting a discussion in our London studios. I'm joined by Viktor Balagadde, a journalist for the newspaper Kommersant UK, Nicu Popescu, an analyst at a think tank called the European Council on Foreign Relations, Pravda, a fellow from St Antony's College, Oxford, and over the line from Moscow by Dmitry Babich, our in-house political analyst. Okay, to get the ball rolling, I'd like to get a single-sentence answer from each of you to the following question. Maybe starting with you, Dmitry. In your opinion, is there enough political will in NATO to guarantee stability in Afghanistan after 2014?
I don't think so. And in general, I don't think NATO is capable of guaranteeing stability anywhere.
Okay, and over to you, Nicu.
Well, I put it differently. I don't think anyone can guarantee anything about Afghanistan, including NATO, but no one would be able to guarantee anything about Afghanistan in the foreseeable future.
Okay, and Alex?
I agree. There's nothing that can guarantee stability in Afghanistan, but what we're talking about, is there a likely decline in ability and the capacity to do so? And I think it's looking that way at the moment.
Okay, and Viktor?
Well, I think the question was whether there is a political will, and the question was not whether they can guarantee. And I think that there is a political will, but it doesn't mean that they will be capable to achieve their goal.
Maybe I'll turn back to you at that stage, Alex, because you said you're seeing a decline. Are you referring specifically to what's been taking place, the fallout between the US and Pakistan over whether or not they're going to get their supply routes back open, or the incoming French President Hollande's decision to pull out French troops earlier than anticipated?
I think more the latter, the French decision to pull out earlier. It doesn't mean to say there won't be an orderly disengagement from Afghanistan. I think that will take place, but there'll be more and more problems about agreeing on how exactly to do that. And of course, as others have said, the long-term strategy for stabilization or continued stabilization is going to have to be different from the one adopted previously. I think we must have a much more economically focused strategy towards Afghanistan to maintain stability in the country.
Okay, Dmitry, do you think that is the big issue, that the French decision to pull out early is a sign of lack of political will, lack of intention to stay there, while European countries are, of course, facing terrible, terrible economic times?
Well, I think that to a certain extent it's pragmatic stance, because it was not very clear from the very beginning what NATO and the United States were actually trying to achieve in Afghanistan. If they wanted to make it a modern democratic country, then it was an utopia. And maybe Hollande is just, in a delayed way, realizing what was quite clear to most of the people who had visited Afghanistan years ago. If there was a more modest desire to see Afghanistan as a secure place, then NATO and the United States should have paid more attention to what Russia was saying, and probably should have engaged Russia in Afghanistan's post-war reconstruction, something that wasn't done. So now I think it doesn't really matter much what is behind Hollande's intentions. All the mistakes were already made.
You say there's been like a lack of Russian engagement. Maybe following on with that point, what kind of engagement could have taken place between Russia and the US? And maybe Afghanistan is one issue where Russia does have a shared interest there. I noticed the assistance of Russia in a supply base in Ulyanovsk.
Yes, indeed. Russia is not interested in Afghanistan's falling into the hand of Islamic terrorists. And in fact, in 2001, it was Russia who played a crucial role in removing the Taliban, because few people remember that most of the work was done by the so-called Northern Alliance, Afghans themselves who were armed and aided by Russia. But in fact, Russia has a lot of experience in Afghanistan in the 80s. We actually went through the same stages that American troops went through during their stay in Afghanistan. First, there was a very successful invasion. Then there was an attempt to crush the resistance by so-called troop surge. And in the end, it's always an attempt to find a political solution and a pullout. And Russia had several very important industrial projects in Afghanistan which could have provided jobs to Afghans. But Americans and American allies in NATO instead preferred to give all the contracts to their companies. And the result was that Afghanistan does not have a modern industry, and it still has hundreds of thousands of people unemployed. So basically, Russia was disregarded in all ways, and I don't think it aided anyone, except the Taliban, maybe.
I think engagement, including engagement with Russia, is all good. But of course, what mattered in the last decade on Afghanistan would have been substantial amounts of money or troops. And I don't think if we talk about Russia, there was too much political will or openness from Russia to contribute either troops or huge amounts of money. So in this respect, yes, there's been some low-level engagement on Central Asia, on the logistics base in Ulyanovsk. But let's also be frank in the sense that Russia did not have itself a proper strategy on Afghanistan. Regarding the investment climate, we know what kind of an investment climate in Afghanistan is. And I don't think that Russian or Chinese or American investments would have made a big difference in the situation in Afghanistan, given the kind of security context one sees in this country.
Maybe turning to you at that stage, Viktor, you took a slightly more positive tone than the other analysts here when you said that there is a degree of political will left for Afghanistan. Do you perhaps possibly agree with the NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen when he said that in Afghanistan there will be no rush for the exits?
The reason why I say that there is a political will, because I think it's important for any political leader, whether you are in Europe or you are in America, to be successful in Afghanistan. If you are successful in Afghanistan, you'll gain more votes, I would imagine, in your own motherland. And so I'm not surprised that the French president who came over and said that one of his first steps would be to pull out French troops from Afghanistan. Actually, to my experience, this is a trend. If you look at the Spanish government, which when they came over to power a few years ago, one of their first steps were to pull out the troops of Iraq. I mean, what was done with the French voters was just to send a message to them that the foreign policy of France will be now more pragmatic and, if I can say so, more pacifistic, if I can express like that.
Does anybody have an opinion on this latest development, which is the split between Pakistan and the US? My question, I suppose, is how important is the Pakistan territory to provide military support to the operations in Afghanistan? And what do you think about Pakistan's demands from a deal for reopening these routes? A public apology, a review of drone policy, and an increase in the transit charge for vehicles into Afghanistan from $250 per vehicle all the way up to $5,000 per vehicle. That's a huge amount of money.
Basically, I think that relations between Pakistan and the United States since the beginning of the American operation and international operation in Afghanistan in the year 2001, they have never been very good. And now that after the raid of U.S. commandos into Islamabad, where they just destroyed Bin Laden and his whole compound, that was very badly seen in Pakistan. So from the very beginning, it was a huge miscalculation to think that the so-called southern route would be safer than the northern route via the territory of Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, the former Central Asian republics of the Soviet Union, or through the territory of Russia. But in Russia, there is a certain unease about helping Americans to maintain this northern route, because it seems to many Russians that Americans are not making enough effort to combat drug production in Afghanistan. In the last 10 years, we have seen more and more drugs coming from Afghanistan to Russia and to other countries of Europe. So basically, when we asked that questions to the Americans, the answer was usually that it's not our business. We fight Taliban, and we don't care what happens to the drugs, because basically if farmers have no other source of income, that's their problem. That was, of course, not officially announced, but that was, the message. So now, if the United States indeed doesn't want to lose Pakistan and Russia after it, I think it already lost Pakistan, the United States will have to do something to make Russia believe that they're indeed working not only in their interest but also in our interest in Afghanistan.
Clearly there are shared Russian and US interests, particularly post-14, to try and stabilize Afghanistan. And it's just been said, it's not just about security in a military sense, it's also about drug security. And something like 25% of the total drug production from Afghanistan comes through Central Asia, through Russia, and there have been differences over the strategies to combat that. It's not just that the Americans are seen by the Russians as not having the will to do it, it's also a concern. The Americans are engaging the Central Asian states in doing so in a way that leaves Russia out of the picture. So Russia has its own anti-drug strategy, but it's clearly in both their interest to get their act together on the drug scene, because that's going to be a perennial feature of the problem surrounding Afghanistan.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at this week's NATO summit. I'm joined by Viktor Balagadde, a journalist for the newspaper Kommersant UK, Nicu Popescu, an analyst at a think tank called the European Council on Foreign Relations, Alex Pravda, a fellow from St Antony's College, Oxford, and Dmitry Babich, our in-house political analyst. Maybe I'd like to stay with you there for a moment, Alex. Another big issue at the NATO summit has been the agreement of NATO leaders to launch the first phase of a missile shield designed to knock out attacks on Europe by enemies such as Iran. This system has, of course, been extremely controversial. It soured relations with Moscow, which fears it will undermine its own nuclear deterrent. Maybe you could just give us a bit of a background here. Why is this missile defense shield so controversial?
Well, it really goes back a long way to SDI. If you remember, Ronald Reagan launched a missile shield based in space, which caused a lot of problems with then the late Soviet regime. And then concerns were voiced after the end of the Cold War because assurances had been given that NATO, first of all, wouldn't move east, and secondly, if it did move east, it wouldn't move infrastructure east, and certainly wouldn't move what was seen to be threatening infrastructure far east. And yet this missile shield, which has been discussed for at least 10 years now, ballistic missile shield, which deploys in Eastern Europe, now Poland and Romania, has always been seen by Moscow as a direct threat and challenge unless Moscow is involved directly in shaping it. And of course what the Russians want is joint ownership of a shared missile shield, which has been under discussion but so far has not been success in agreeing that with the Americans. So the demand now from the Russian side is to have legal guarantees that any missile shield which develops in and deployed in Eastern Europe is not going to be a threat to Russian security, and they want the detailed technical information to bear that out. And so far the Americans have not been able to agree that with the Russians. So it's an outstanding problem. On the other hand, what you've got to see is that arguments about missile shields, arguments about nuclear arms, are the one connection that Russia still has with America, which puts it in a position of not equality necessarily, but sitting at the same table. So even though it's a divisive issue, it's an issue which Moscow still wants to maintain as its connection with the States.
And in your opinion, what is the core of this issue? What's the problem here? Was it the fact that NATO was reneging, or is it the fact that Russia has got too high expectations and demands?
The main issue in this arms control and arms problem, as in all, is confidence and trust. It's not actually about the exact range of the radars or the missile ranges and numbers and so on. It's about confidence that there is no trickery going on. So it's a matter of information sharing. It's a matter of co-decision making. And that's not been achieved at the moment. But I suspect that once we get through this period of pre-election time in the United States, where Putin clearly didn't think he was going to get anything out of Obama before, hopefully he's re-elected, and that's why he didn't go to the G8. After that period is over, there probably will be more productive talks about this particular problem.
Maybe I'll turn back to you then, Nicu. Is that right? Is it just an issue of confidence and trust?
I don't think it's just an issue of confidence and trust, because this would be the political logic, whereas the military logic is always prepare for the worst case scenario, and you shouldn't trust what your partners or non-partners say they will do, but you should prepare for the fact that whatever capabilities they have, at some point they might be used against you. So now we have primarily a clash of two military logics. The Americans prepare for a worst-case scenario on Iran and are building this missile defense infrastructure, whereas the Russians are fearing that they will have to prepare to a worst-case scenario vis-à-vis the Americans. And how to get out of this dilemma is very difficult. And of course, with more trust and confidence building on a political level, some of these issues could be alleviated. But there's clearly a kind of contradiction of logics between the way the militaries are supposed to think about their job and between the way politicians would try to assuage some of these fears. years. And I guess the only way to try and get out of this binary opposition between Russia and the EU is by having a much more cooperative stance on Iran. And of course, part of the problem was that for the last 10 years, the dialogue between Russia and the West on Iran hasn't been good. It improved in the last couple of years. But if you look at the last decade, when the whole missile defense discussion was preparing the stage for what is happening now in Romania and Turkey, then of course Russia was not on a very cooperative footing vis-à-vis the West regarding Iran, which at its turn fueled the arguments of those who wanted the missile defense.
Victor, turning to you at that stage, both the other analysts describe it as the problem stems from a lack of confidence and trust. Why that is most likely to be true, it doesn't actually propose any answers or solutions.
Well, no, it doesn't. So, I guess the only answer and solution here will be is to develop this. What we are lacking is confidence and trust. And I think Moscow here has their own grounds. I think Moscow has a right of expressing their concern about the new anti-missile equipment being constructed in Poland and in Romania and in other countries. And as Alex said at the very beginning, when we started discussing this issue, this is actually very right. There was some kind of an oral, at least, agreement between the leaders of the Soviet Union and the NATO when the Warsaw Pact was disassembled, that if the NATO is going to expand, it will expand only nominally, legally, but there will be no any infrastructure, no any military infrastructure transferred towards the Russian borders. So this was an unofficial agreement. Here we see that there is, this agreement has been put under evaluation, and here you get Moscow trying to express their concerns about all this. And actually, if you remember what Mr. Putin said when there was a meeting in Munich 3 or 4 years ago,
2007.
That's 2007. That was 5 years ago already. Yeah, when he read his famous speech in Munich, and he was actually offering the Western powers to share this anti-missile system which is being erected in Europe, and that Russia will become a full member of it. And I think that could put the Moscow concerns under control. Moscow will not be so much concerned about all the military equipment if they will be playing a full role in the whole system. But unfortunately, they didn't find common grounds with Americans, and now we are just left with some kind of a hope. And of course, I do agree that here we have just to wait till the American elections pass. And Mr. Obama did say to Mr. Medvedev that what he has to pass over to Mr. Putin is that he has to go through his elections, and then later he'll have more space for maneuver.
Are you talking about the hot mic situation that we heard,
That's
the
right,
meeting
yes.
between Barack Obama?
I'll pass it over to Vladimir.
Yeah. I will transmit this to Vladimir. What was your reading of that? Because Obama, when he was caught on microphone talking, I believe it was in the South Korean capital Seoul during a nuclear security summit, he said that on all these issues, particularly missile defense, there can be some room for negotiation. Do you think that was sincere?
I think so. being a political leader of the United States and going through these elections in America, of course, he has to think what his voters are expecting from him. And it is more, he's in very limited, his space is very limited to maneuver and to find a compromise with the Russian side. So, of course, it would be much better to go through this election process. And then when he'll have another 4 years ahead of him, he is hoping to find some common ground with Russians so that this missile will be taken in full employment.
This is the voice of Russia.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at this week's NATO summit. I'm joined by Viktor Balagadde, a journalist for the newspaper Kommersant UK, Nicu Popescu, an analyst at a think tank called the European Council on Foreign Relations, Alex Pravda, a fellow from St Antony's College, Oxford, and Dmitry Babich, our in-house political analyst. Alex, maybe I'd like to turn to you there, because we got onto this hot mic situation, the meeting between Obama and Medvedev a couple of months back. Part of the deal that seemed to be being offered by Obama there was that Putin would give Obama more space until his election period was over, and then there could be some kind of agreement on missile defense. But from what we've seen with Putin since his inauguration, do you think it's fair to say that Putin isn't giving him that space?
Not yet, because I don't think Putin thinks there are going to be many returns before the American elections for giving any space, so there's a waste of time. And of course, we saw before the election a lot of rhetoric from Putin about an assertive and strong Russia, which has respect. One thing that would be interesting to say about this, when we get back to a second Obama administration and there's more political negotiations, there will be about ballistic missile defense. One thing they'll have to watch on both sides, on all sides, is what was earlier referred to as the force of military logic, politically managing military confrontations and threats is difficult when you're in an era, as we are at the moment on the Russian side, of increased militarization. Increased spending is about over $660 billion going to be spent, and up to over 700 in the next 10 years on military hardware. So the huge military machine, the military industrial complex as it used to be called, is really rolling again. And I think even though people at the top, the politicians, want to manage that process, not allow it to get out of control, it's going to be a more formidable task, particularly as China is also increasing spending on military. So is India, and the United States, of course, is still the lead spender. So politicians always have a problem of how to manage the fallout from militarization, and being told by their own militaries that they have to, as was said before, work on a worst-case analysis basis.
Before I put that one over to Nicu, I just want to throw one thing back at you. You don't seem to have much hope there for Obama's rival in the elections, Mitt Romney, no?
Personally, I don't think so. No, I think Obama will get it. It won't be easy, but I think Obama will get it because I think the economy is doing relatively well in the States. There's no disaster story there, and the elections are going to be resolved on economic issues, not on military foreign policy issues.
Okay, Nicu, on these issues that we're talking about, what we've seen of Putin since he's won the election and been inaugurated again as president, we've seen a number of things. We're talking about military spending, the cabinet appointments that have happened, and his decision to drop his visit to the G8 and NATO summit. What do these things say to you? What do they add up to?
Well, it's still early in the game, so we're not certain of what Putin's exact foreign policy agenda would be for the next up to a year. But I think when it comes to the anti-ballistic missile discussions, what is also clear is that Putin wouldn't like to fuel and give reasons and arguments for Mitt Romney to attack Obama on missile defense. So in a sense, Putin probably has all the reasons for the next 6 to 7 months not to be very aggressive vis-a-vis the United States on missile defense in order not to give Mitt Romney arguments to attack Obama on this. Even if Obama is not in a position, perhaps even in a year from now, to make Russia a substantial offer over missile defense, at least Obama would be much more open to looking for a deal or a face-saving situation for both sides over missile defense.
You're saying that Putin then is playing a bit softer, but that seems to be a bit counterintuitive because on the face of it, he seems to be playing hardball, doesn't he?
I don't think it's that hardball. Putin always calibrated a bit of an aggressive rhetoric with a bit of a pragmatic attitude. And even in the last few months, we've seen a good dose of anti-Western discourse in the Russian political class, but at the same time it was much less intense than 5 years ago around the time of the Munich speech, and it was also coupled with very concrete cooperation on the ground, with the Ulyanovsk logistics base being a good example of this. So Putin is calibrating sometimes aggressive rhetoric with de facto pragmatic cooperation, and I think this is the most likely way he would behave, at least for the next few months.
You don't think his calibration, his recalibration is broader than that in the way that some analysts have described it? You look at his first foreign trip is to Minsk. He's focusing more on an integration with Kazakhstan, Belarus, possibly Kyrgyzstan. That there isn't a broader reshaping of the Putin foreign policy, a retrenching to where Russia can be stronger?
Partly yes, but I wouldn't take the first trips of foreign leaders in this part of the world as very good indicators of something. I think most Western partners of Russia were quite happy with the way they cooperated with Medvedev, but if we actually go back to his early presidency, we'd remember that the first trips by Medvedev were to Kazakhstan and China. If you'd go to Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, his first trip was to Brussels, which was a kind of indicator of the way things have not turned out to be. So it's natural all Russian leaders go to their first trips in the CIS, but I think the Russian leaders are at the same time pragmatic and rational enough to maintain relatively good open channels of dialogue with the West while playing sometimes aggressive political rhetoric, either for domestic political consumption or for part of a discursive diplomacy they engage with the West.
Viktor, what do you think from what we've seen of Putin so far and what that spells out for the future foreign policy of Russia while he's in the top job?
My perception of his first act of cancelling his meeting in America and not taking part in G8 was that I think Mr. Putin is trying to shift the center of power from the old capitals, from the old European and American capitals into this new G20 or this new emerging BRICS countries. And that's why he underlined that most of the global affairs should be discussed not not in the meeting of G8, but in the meetings of United Nations General Assembly or in the Security Council of United Nations. And again, he's going in Mexico, and I mean, he'll be present there, where he'll meet eventually Mr. Obama in Mexico when the G20 countries will meet. And I think that's what Mr. Putin is really rooting for. He's trying to make the countries like Brazil, South Africa, India, and China to play a bigger role on the international scene, and to create some kind of a rivalry to London, Paris, Berlin, and Washington. So I guess that was the main sign of Mr. Putin's decision not to attend the G8 summit.
Do you think that's a smart move? Because it could also be seen as dangerous and possibly able to backfire if you put your weight in the G8 and the G20. You know, Russia's economy isn't so big, isn't so strong. Isn't this just another possibility by which Russia gets sidelined?
I think it will be much easier for Russia to compete with countries like India and Brazil than competing with such economies like French, German, or American economies. And if you look even back in history, Soviet Union was always supporting these countries. There was a movement of neutral countries led by India, the non-alignment movement from 80s, I think it is 80s and 70s, and Soviet Union was very much in support of this movement. So here, by supporting and by emphasizing on G20 agenda, I think it's Mr. Putin's policy of bringing different issues on top of the table when the nations come and discuss things. And it's just, as I said, like at the very beginning, I think that was just more like an attempt of creating some kind of rivalry among the states.
Alex, final comments from you on this issue of rivalry between the US and Russia. Earlier you spoke of the possibility of smoothing of relations between the two, but do you think there's any future in the reset?
There certainly is. I think we'll see a process of increasing negotiations on BMD and things. Talking about G20 and the whole Putin emphasis in the mid and long term to siding with the less developed or emerging powers, it's not a matter of rivalry or conflict. It's a matter of what's sometimes called soft balancing. Soft balancing using the Chinese alignment, using G20, using ASEAN, using Asia, and not least because not just of the United States, but because these are the countries, particularly China, which are critical to Russia's own security problems. The Far East was pointed out by Putin in his election speeches as being the area of defense and security priority. And the whole near abroad depends on cooperation with China and with Pakistan, with India, much more than with the United States. So I think it's a matter of soft balancing, continuing engagement with the states. Will see a more normal climate return and a longer-term shift towards the East, toward the alignment with China. Of course, it's a critical relationship, but also the most difficult relationship for Russia to handle.
Nicu, longer-term alignment with China?
Definitely not. I think what Russia would do, and I would agree with this with Professor Pravda, is that Russia will try to balance between the West and China and the other centers of power in order to beef up its own room for maneuver, its own security, and its own power in international relations without making a choice either in favor of conflict or in favor of an alliance with either China or the West.
Okay, that was Nicu Popescu, an analyst at a think tank called the European Council on Foreign Relations, saying that the future Russian foreign policy is going to be a delicate balance between the world's big powers. I was also joined by Viktor Balagadde, a journalist for the newspaper Kommersant UK, Alex Pravda, a fellow from St Antony's College, Oxford, and our in-house political analyst over the line from Moscow, that's Dmitry Babich. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl. Stay tuned for the latest update on what's making headlines around the world.